It's somewhat easy to forget, but the war in Ukraine is still raging, and as it does, the U.S. inches perilously closer and closer to World War III. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in January of 2022, a combined 1 million individuals have died on both sides of this conflict. The United States, meanwhile, has sent $55.7 billion, that's your money and mine, in military assistance to the Eastern European country. And Congress has approved upwards of $175 billion in both aid and military assistance to support the Ukrainian government headed by Ukrainian President Zelensky and its allies. So the U.S. is essentially footing the bill for this war in Ukraine. And if Ukraine has its way, we will probably be paying for it for quite some time, possibly even with American soldiers. On Monday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took time out of his very busy schedule to make a de facto campaign pit stop for Vice President Kamala Harris at a munitions factory in the Keystone state of Pennsylvania, all the while begging for the cash flow to keep on coming from Uncle Sam. Zelensky, alongside Governor Josh Shapiro, signed bombs in the name of democracy, of course. It was essentially a tacit endorsement for Kamala Harris, who wants to keep that gravy train flowing for Ukraine just as long as she possibly can. Zelensky's trip, by the way, was paid for in part by the good old American taxpayer, you and me, in case you're wondering how he afforded such a trip in the midst of a war so expensive that he requires us to pay for that war. Now, you would think Zelensky wants his country to win the war, right? But have we stopped to think about what does that actually mean to Zelensky? Has anyone bothered to investigate or even ask Zelensky for a definition of victory? Well, it doesn't seem like anybody's interested in that, at least on the side of the left or the mainstream media. What does winning for Ukraine actually look like? Except from Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, we do have an answer to this question. He's repeatedly said, we need to get rid of Putin. Talk about inviting World War III. If I'm Putin, I view America subsidizing Ukraine's military as war between Russia and the U.S. And then top it off with American senators talking about unseating Putin. How do you think Putin is going to react? But maybe World War III is exactly what Zelensky wants. Because the one politician who has said it's time to end the war, yeah, that's right, Donald Trump, that's the politician Zelensky criticizes. Zelensky hacked President Trump, calling he and Senator J.D. Vance inept and radical. Isn't it funny how they use the same words that should be used to describe themselves as an insult for their opposition? This is what Zelensky claimed. This is his quote. My feeling is that Trump doesn't really know how to stop the war, even if he might think he knows how. With this war, oftentimes, the deeper you look at it, the less you understand. Isn't that funny? Of course, we the people, we can't understand it. Only Zelensky has to tell us how to think. An interesting comment to make, considering that under Trump, the world was at peace. A peace not seen in generations. In fact, Trump was remarkably good at foreign policy. And Zelensky should remember that Russia invaded Ukraine under President Barack Obama, and then again under President Joe Biden. When Donald Trump was in office, Putin dared not go near Ukraine. Trump negotiated the Abraham Accords as well, forced NATO countries to pay more of their fair share, and effectively wiped out ISIS. So the idea that Trump wouldn't know how to negotiate an end to this Ukraine war seems a bit preposterous, and I suspect Zelensky knows that. Well, it only seems preposterous if you've already written off negotiations to end the war altogether, and I think that may be key here. It appears that Zelensky already has written off negotiations. The Ukrainian leader went on to blast J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, saying that he was, quote, dangerous, and that Vance's message seems to be that Ukraine must make a sacrifice. But I believe Zelensky said that we have shielded America from total war. Yeah, right. First of all negotiations require sacrifice. Countries who are losing wars, as Ukraine arguably is, or who are in a stalemate, which Ukraine is at best, don't quite have the leverage at the negotiating table. Hence, sacrifices of some sort are required if you value human life. So yeah, Ukraine should have made concessions to Russia a long time ago. Not because Putin is morally correct, he's not, but because 1 million people have died. And Ukraine is never going to win outright unless they concede some land and put a stop to this war. But you have to want to put a stop to a war to put a stop to a war. Otherwise, what Zelensky's doing is he's asking of the world a suicide mission funded by us. It's outrageous. It's anti-humanity. And now Zelensky's here in the United States to coerce you and I to be part of this suicide mission. On Thursday, he's going to the White House to present the Biden administration with what he calls a victory plan. Sources say that a key part of the plan hinges upon the U.S. giving Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles to fire into Russia. The Kremlin has said that if that happens, then Russia would consider itself at war with NATO. And can you blame them for thinking that way? It's actually rational thinking. If Russia attacked a NATO country, then the U.S. would have boots on the ground against a nuclear superpower. But for some reason, Zelensky says that if the U.S. doesn't go along with his so-called victory plan, then the U.S. will find itself in a very long, protracted war. What? So here to break it down, from the Dossier, if you don't subscribe on Substack to the Dossier, I highly recommend that you do. He's one of my favorite journalists because he's correct about his reporting and he's honest. It's Jordan Schachtel. Jordan, good to see you.
Hey, Liz. Great monologue. Thanks for the intro.
Okay, Jordan, tell me what's going on here, because it seems obvious that when you start a war, you should have a goal in mind and a way to achieve that goal being victory. And I don't believe that they don't have one. I think that they're not revealing it to us. Am I wrong?
Yeah, geopolitically speaking, they're in an increasingly more untenable position. At the beginning of this war, it's probably the best chance to negotiate for peace. We're several years in now, and the Ukrainians keep slowly losing land to kind of this slow-moving Russian push into eastern Ukraine, specifically taking lands that have historically been friendly to the Russian people and the Russian government. So they've been playing this strategically, without having to worry about so much of domestic pushback within these cities and towns that have historically been held by multiple countries. So they don't really feel such a strong allegiance to Ukraine. I mean, it's such a different situation. Like you find all of these modern historians and pundits and think tankers all using the World War II analogy, but it's such a different situation. You have this nuclear-powered borderline superpower versus an impoverished country of people who have very similar, ethnic and historic descent and ancestry. So it's a completely different situation. And what I find is that, unfortunately, the leadership in Ukraine has totally failed their people. Zelensky, in particular, I have a couple thoughts on him. Because his position is so ridiculous. He wants to take back Crimea, which has been in Russia's hands for a decade now, and the people of Crimea don't want that. So, how exactly would that occur? And you have all these weird problems with this maximalist position that Zelensky's taking. And I think he's serious about it, which is alarming. And if he's serious about a position of no concessions ever, then the war is going to continue in perpetuity. And my second thought on this is that Zelensky doesn't really have much control over his own country's affairs. He's kind of surrendered the economy to outside forces. What happens in war is that, the economy takes a huge hit. He's had to take out all these loans, and he's very much beholden to kind of this Western coalition on Wall Street and in Washington. So who's really calling the shots?
What I agree with you that economies take a hit. So during war, that's obvious. That's happened in every war that I can ever think of. But what do you mean he took out loans and he's not being controlled? Or he's not in control, someone's controlling him?
Right. So at the onset of the war, and of course this goes back many years and decades, the history of the conflict. But at the onset of the war, the Ukrainian National Bank and the Ukrainian currency took a huge hit. And they were in dire straits immediately. They were already in a really bad position. Ukraine is one of the top 3 poorest countries in Europe. So you're already in an awful position. And then you have people like BlackRock coming in and kind of buying up their nation state, essentially, and granting them loans. Arguably, they needed these loans.
BlackRock came into Ukraine and bought up significant pieces of the Ukrainian economy.
I don't think that they bought the land, but the loans were made, and loans need to be paid back. And in exchange for loans, these people and institutions are going to want something. And this is kind of how superpowers and their attached financial networks control small countries. So I think that Zelensky has some autonomy, but it's much more limited than I would say the corporate media is leading on.
So do you view him the way that we all probably view Joe Biden at this point? That, yeah, he's the figurehead, but he's not the one. He's basically a puppet. There's someone else who's pulling the strings.
I view him similar to like a Jack Dorsey when it became clear that the board of Twitter had been completely overtaken by all these other outside powerful forces. And unfortunately, Jack at the time decided to go full, Black Trans Lives Matter mode and just endorsing like the hyper woke corporate speak instead of like, similar to like a guy like Zuckerberg. Facebook is entirely controlled too. And they've chosen not to speak out. So Zelensky, I think, does not. He wants to play the game. He wants the political prestige. He wants the favors. He is in a position to call for an end to the conflict, but he's certainly, he's following the message. He's the Lindsey Graham of Kiev, unfortunately.
Well, well, the way that I view this is not only an anti-humanity war because what's in the interest of the Ukrainian people and the Russian people too, right? Russian soldiers aren't necessarily ideologically aligned with Putin. They don't necessarily want to die in a war with Ukraine. Some of them maybe do, I don't know, but a million people is not something to just, a million people who've died is not something to just dismiss. So not only is this an anti-humanity war, something that Ukraine can't practically, I don't think any military strategists would say, oh yeah, Ukraine's in a position where they can demand everything and not negotiate at all. That's just absurd. I view this as a globalist exercise because if the United States continues to give blank checks essentially to Ukraine, and it's not just, oh, taxpayers are footing this bill, they're printing money, which devalues our currency, then this ends up not only causing inflation here domestically, we're on the path to the US dollar being so devalued that it's going to be abandoned as the world reserve currency, which is the United States, our primary negotiating or our primary leverage in negotiations around the world. It's not because we're constantly threatening to use our military power against other countries. It's because our economic power is so strong that countries who want to keep doing business with us kind of do have to at least align somewhat with our values or not annoy us too bad. And if we lose that, then we've lost our status in the world. So I view this as the globalists trying to take the United States down without using military conflict directly with the United States unless it's necessary.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. Ultimately, the biggest losers are the Ukrainian people who are losing everything. They're losing their sovereignty, they're losing their well-being, their families, everyone who's close to them, either physically, emotionally, spiritually. They have to be able to find a way out. And this is not, again, a Winston Churchill, the Nazis are coming type moment. It's such a historically different situation. There is no parallel to World War II. And it comes down to Ukraine's going to have to make a tough deal, and they're going to have to hope that Russia's willing to give a little back. I think that maybe Russia would give a little back under a Trump presidency. But like there's some non-starter issues like Crimea, like some other cities that, Russia probably lost 50,000 troops to win and hold. So, I totally dismiss the idea that Russia's trying to, impose a genocide upon the Ukrainian people. But if this war continues for a long enough time, Ukraine's just going to continue to lose more chunks of their country. If you have hostile forces in your lands, they're not just going to like sit around forever. They're just going to keep pushing forward. But I hope for the sake of Ukraine, really, that Trump wins and really demands that both sides get to the negotiating table. And, there's many incentives like for Russia, too, to want to end this war. Ukraine, it's obvious. But for Russia, they're not really, in an economically strong position. They have a lot of problems of their own, too. And they probably want to re-access global financial markets that no, American citizen can put $1 into Russian markets, and that has been, a significant blow to the Russian economy. They found ways to counteract that through partnering with China and India and elsewhere, but there's no force like the American market, and I think Trump really understands that. So, if Russia wants to come back to the table and be a part of the global community, even if it was unfair or fair, it doesn't really matter. The morality of the situation, I think that's the bargaining chip to bring Russia to the table and maybe have them give a little bit of the land back. But yeah, I totally agree. This war needs to come to an end. And with people like Zelensky in charge of Ukraine, it it's hard to fathom that unless he's just forced to do something.
So what do you think that would look like if President Trump wins in, what are we, 40 odd days until the election? What is that going to look like? Trump says that he's going to be able to negotiate an end to this war. I mean, all presidential candidates talk about this proverbial day one. On day one, I'll do this. And he basically has made that same promise about the war. Do you think that's realistic? Will he be able to get that done?
I think he'll be able to get it done eventually. I don't know about the day one stuff, but there's definitely a path forward. There's leverage on Ukraine and there's leverage on Russia. I mean, I could see perhaps Trump dangling one more aid package, and if you take the aid, you need to end the war. That kind of thing, because they really. The money is not being properly distributed. There's all these infamous stories about these Ukrainian commanders signing for these weapons with they draw up the receipt and just like hand it to the American officials, and they're like, oh, okay, I guess that's good. But a lot of the money and weapons, who knows where that stuff is going? So you have to assume that the hundreds of billions of dollars in aid that we've given to Ukraine have not gone to the Ukrainian people. It's just effectively like a money laundering scheme for the people in charge over there and for the defense industry to kind of here to like pump their public market bags a little bit. So I think that there's a lot of leverage that Trump can impose on both sides, and it's in the interest of both sides if they're thinking rationally to end the war. But we're in a very irrational environment where you have, and I very much blame the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that for imposing this madness, because they were hyper aggressive on the eastern Ukrainian border, encouraging people basically to lob missiles at Russia, but without an effective deterrent. So it was like the worst of both worlds. Russia was fed up with the situation on the border, and then Russia got hyper aggressive, and I think made a miscalculation because they don't want to be shut off from the global economy either. So yeah, there's definitely a path to peace, and I think Trump has a lot of smart people around him and a lot of free thinking geopolitical and foreign policy minds who can get something like that done.
Right. You mean not like Lindsey Graham? The other thing, and by the way, this is worth noting, that when someone like Zelensky, it seems to be on a suicide mission, because that's what it seems like. He does this because he himself feels insulated. He himself feels protected. He's not going to go die on the front lines as he forces other people to do that. And if you have a leader that's behaving in that manner, then you know that they are worse than a fraud, worse than a hoax. That doesn't even accurately describe that kind of behavior. It's so cavalier with human life. It's downright evil. Jordan, thank you for analyzing this, and everyone go subscribe to the Dossier on Substack. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.